Hello and welcome to another video from Hack Engineering. Today we're going to be going through the build on a BMW S54 engine, and we join Chris in the engine building room. It's going to be a pretty long video, and I hope that it really shows sort of the whole build process from start to finish. Obviously we're slightly sped up here, and we actually join Chris with the crank ready in, so what we don't see is the hours of measuring all the main line, so that'll be done without the bearings to make sure the main line's properly round. On this build it used ARP main studs, and the main line actually had to be machined and then honed to get it back to BMW factory spec. So we're running an ACL main bearing on this build. The crank has been ground to 0.25, and on the ACL main bearing we've also got a ground thrust, which we generally try and aim for around the 100 to 120 micron end float. So what we see now is Chris doing the torque passage on the main caps, and obviously there's a sequence to this, so we see him working through and going through in stages before moving up to a bigger torque wrench for the final torque figure. We just saw him there do a little spin of the crank, making sure that it's all good. Obviously all our measurements are correct, we know the crank's straight. So here Chris has put his D2I onto the end of the block and is measuring the end float. This is pretty critical, because if that's too tight then the oil film on that thrust washer is going to cause you quite a few issues, so getting that ground to a specific specification is very critical. We now of course see the engine back up in the orientation that would sit in the car, and Chris is just oiling the bores. Of course, with any engine build, and we haven't seen, is all the preparation that went into the block, and obviously all the machine work that we've carried out in-house as well. So this block was rebored to suit an 87.5mm piston, and the deck face was also machined to give it a good mating surface for the head gasket. We can now see Chris is slowly, one by one, placing all the pistons into the engine. These have been built up onto SP component rods. So these are a Mahle Motorsport piston, which are a very nice piston, and are really gonna make this quite a nice build. Of course, another stage that we haven't seen is the gapping of the piston rings. So this was carried out prior to the build. So we like to get all the measurements and all the machining done. So it's just a case of final assembly, and as we can see, Chris can nicely lay out all the components on his benches and work through the build process. So with all the rods in and the caps loosely on, Chris is now just making sure that everything's coated with either ARP assembly grease or a assembly lube on the bearing running faces. Now what we won't do is we won't torque up the caps on the con rods. They will actually be fastened to the stretch figure that is supplied with the rod. So this is a far more accurate way, and it's actually, so Chris will put a small DTI around the bolt, and it will actually measure the amount of stretch that's happening as he's doing it up, and that way we can do it all to the same figure. All the measurements will also be taken on all the ARP fasteners before the fastener was used, and that way should the engine come back to us we can check for stretch and see if that fastener is still within the original specs. So Chris is still working through putting all the pistons in. Pretty critical to use a correct tool rather than a self-expanding multi-use piston ring clamp. We get conical piston insertion tools. We buy them in, or for oddball stuff we will make them in the machine shop. This is really going to be a lovely engine, which is going up to Scotland when it's finished. So we're excited to get this one out the door. Moving on, Chris just doing a few rotations of the engine just to get a feel for it and make sure that everything is as expected. Now the next stage is really going to be putting the oil pump on, I'd have thought. So as we can see here, another stage of it is actually filling out all the data sheets. So we've actually got all our information, whether it be, you know, all the different piston wall measurements, piston to wall clearance, and that data is all taken down and then kept in a build book, so we can fully send that engine out the door knowing that everything is absolutely perfect. So here we can see Chris is putting that stretch gauge on all the conrod bolts and slowly doing them up. Here we'll also be recording a torque figure as well as that stretch figure, and that is why that torque wrench is being used there. As we see, he's done 1 and 6. I expect he'll do 2 and 5 next, and then finish in the middle of 3 and 4 because it's a straight 6 orientation. So working through, going back and just recording all that data as he goes. So the S54 is obviously one of the engines we probably build most here at Hack Engineering. It's a cast iron block, standard is 87mm bore, but we've taken it out to 87.5. This is the biggest you can go due to the only having a 91mm bore spacing. So there's not a huge amount of meat between the cylinders, and of course we do see many that have failed the head gasket and generally go between 1 and 2 or 5 and 6, but we have seen them in cases where they've actually blown the head gasket in between every cylinder. If caught early, this doesn't really cause any damage, but worst case scenario is you keep running it with the blown head gasket and you will see deterioration of the head to the point where it may melt a passageway through, or also superheat that small bit of metal in between the bores and crack the block. We've also got a couple of engines in the background there, so we've got a S14 in at the moment, and also another S54 which has been sleeved down to 85.5mm, which will be going for a turbo application, lower compression than standard. So Chris is now just checking that those con rods have got the correct amount of play forward and back. It's another important measurement that's pretty critical to keep. So here we can see Chris is just inserting a couple of new dowels. So these are the oil pump dowels, and there we have a brand new genuine BMW oil pump going on. This has been built up using a VAC Motorsport upgraded pump shaft and sprocket on the front, and of course these are then torqued down. What we can't see there is obviously we've got the chain on as well. So Chris having a little tidy up before moving on to the next job. And just torquing that sprocket nut. I expect he's nipped out the build room to go and get the lock wire pliers, so the front sprocket on the oil pump will be lock wired together. Here we go. That's what he's doing there. Just to ensure that that sprocket will not come off at all in the future or loosen. And the oil pickup pipes. So these are varying, so later engines had a slightly different pickup pipe design. Oil pumps are very similar to the S50, but likewise the pickup pipes are slightly different, and on the S54 they're just a push fit into the pump, as on the S50 they had a small securing bolt. We can now see the main timing chain, so it's a genuine part, as well as brand new genuine guides going on, with new O-rings and new circlips throughout. Once these are all in, we'll be able to fit the front cover. I expect Chris is also just fitting the new oil gallery bungs, so before every build the gallery bungs are removed from the block and cleaned out right down that gallery. This is vital, especially after these engines suffer from big end failure. So often many second-hand blocks or engines have been taken apart because of big end failure. so making sure there's no foreign debris in those oil galleries is absolutely critical. We're now just nipping up the front cover. Slight bit of wobble on the camera, so apologies there. And of course, every bolt on this engine is torqued to the BMW factory spec and then paint marked. So Chris is now bolted on that front cover, all new gaskets. And a couple more rotations of that engine, making sure that we're all good. And we're just torquing out those pickup tubes now, and a little cut through with some tremendous editing, and we are back to the build. The next part to be fitted is the seal, so that will just be placed in the housing. And that will be fitted once the engine is off the stand. So Chris has now spent a bit of time outside the build room cleaning up the sump. So normally on our full builds these would be vapor blasted, but as this is a competition car, the customer has decided just to get them ultrasonically cleaned in one of our cleaners. So they've still come up not too bad, but not as shiny as they could be. Just one last clean of the gasket face. And it's time for that sump to go on. Yeah, it's the lightest, ever so lightest application of a sealant just on those joins between the front cover and around the rear main housing as well, before the sump is placed on. So one thing to look at if you are replacing the sump on your S54 is of course there are 3 bolts that are slightly longer and they sit above the bowl on the sump, sort of underneath, so there's 3 of those longer ones. A little intro from Luke there from the workshop, I suspect getting a special tool, most likely a timing tool, that are all kept in our build room. And there we go, all the sump bolts are being torqued up, of course, to BMW spec. And the engine is back upright, so a few more checks. Just double checking that piston stand proud on each cylinder, on a little custom made bridge there. And here we can see Chris has been measuring the volumes on both the pistons. He'll also carry out a CC check on the head, and this will just double check that the compression ratio is exactly where we want to be at. This could involve getting a custom made head gasket or actually carrying out some extra machining on the head or the block, but because this is a pretty straightforward build, we can it's more just a safety check, and all the components ones we use many times, so that's just a case of double checking and assembly really. And here we go, the head gasket is now getting placed on top of the block. And that volume check is now being carried out on the head. A small application of grease around the combustion chamber before a small glass plate is placed over the top. And the volume will be measured via the burette, and more data being taken down into those data sheets. So by the time the build's actually finished, probably going to have the best part of 30-40 pieces of paper, varying different measurements, whether it's conrod bearing clearance, conrod housing diameters, crankshaft diameters, bore diameters, cylinder head volume, stand prouds. It's a lot of numbers all written down, and that really does ensure that the best engines go out of our doors. So with those checks now taken, it's time for the head to be placed down. So these are secured with 2 dowels either end, and obviously all the head bolts. So this will be having ARP head studs, and just getting a bit more data, most likely looking at the torque sequence and torque figures for that ARP kit. Of course, available on our website. If you do need any of the parts, please do head across the website. Most of it's kept in stock, especially for S54s, so please place an order and we'll get them out to you as quick as possible. So here we can see Chris will just be greasing up all those ARP head studs, so they won't be greased on the block side. They'll just have a light application of oil, ever so light film, but the top halves on the nuts and the washers will all be greased with the correct lubricant. And that is the studs just getting wound in. Loosely done up before Chris will get his torque wrench and torque the head down. Obviously that is done on a sequence to ARP's recommendations, starting in the middle and working out, so this will be 3 equal passes. 35, 70 and 105 foot-pounds. So Chris's arm's having a good old workout getting this one done. Right, our Vanos unit is now going on. as well as the cams. They all went in quite quickly. So the cam's been torqued down, and just checking that all the followers are correctly installed. Chain tensioner being torqued up. This will then be turned over to check that the timing is correct, and all the locking tools will be reinstalled just to double check that it is correct. Once Chris is happy with the timing, he will then go and check the shims on the top of all the valves. So just checking that all the clearances are correct. So they are 18 to 23, 0.18 to 0.23 on the inlet, and 0.28 to 0.33 on the exhaust. So we'll see him shortly. The rocker cover is just going on, so that has all been torqued up, and there we have an S54 engine built from start to finish. I hope you've enjoyed it, and of course if you want to check out any more videos about the S54 or any other BMW engines or cars, then please head over to the channel. We'd love to see you.